Hello, Blake Rudis here with Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com. And today I want to ask you if you are an HDR hypocrite. Are you? Do you know if you're an HDR hypocrite? Do you know the difference between HDR and tone mapping, or heightened dynamic range techniques and tone mapping? Well, it's critical to understand the difference between the two. So if you're one of those people who has said, I don't like HDR, you might look at this image and say, wow, that's a very clean image, Blake. But in reality, this is what it started with. And I used heightened dynamic range techniques to create this. But don't confuse that with tone mapping. So in this tutorial, we're going to find out if you're an HDR hypocrite, or if you're someone who actually does thoroughly enjoy HDR, I'm going to teach you the difference between heightened dynamic range techniques and tone mapping. Alright, so the purpose of today's tutorial is not really to give you an outwardly HDR tutorial. It's to actually find out if you might be an HDR hypocrite. And the reason why I say this is because I've been an HDR photographer for, 6 years now. And it's been something I've been really passionate about because I love what you can see with HDR photography. The problem is when I come across other people who maybe don't like HDR. They say, oh, you like HDR? Well, I don't really like HDR. HDR is just not for me. I prefer to just use a single image or straight out of camera or blah, blah, blah. The list goes on. But in reality, a lot of these individuals who say they do not like HDR are actually doing HDR. The difference is they may not be tone mapping. So we're going to look at tone mapping and HDR techniques. Now I want you to understand the term HDR. HDR is not 3 letters that makes people run in fear from your photography. HDR means nothing more than high dynamic range. Okay? So just think of it as a heightened amount of dynamic range. That's it. That's all I want you to throw away everything else that you know right now and just think about dynamic range. The contrast between light and dark in your image. All right? That ratio between light and dark in your image. That's all I want you to think about. Because chances are the people that are telling you they hate HDR are doing it. So let's take a look at this. The first thing we're going to do is look at the traditional tone mapping method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab these 3 images right here. You've probably seen these before. I've done this on a long exposure tutorial. We're going to grab these, drag them, drop them right into Photomatix Pro, press OK, and we'll just go ahead and press OK here. Align source images, yep, yada. I'm not going to do a crazy tutorial explaining all of this stuff because I have a lot of that stuff. I really just want to show you this HDR thing versus tone mapping. Alright, so we'll see if there's any ghosts in here. We'll just circle these people because they may have been ghosting. And we'll go preview de-ghosting here. We'll just circle them just in case because it looks like their heads are moving. Alright, so I've got my tone mapped image here. It looks pretty good to start right off the bat. I actually really do like what I've got here. The clouds look great. Let's go ahead and see what our histogram looks like. And based on our histogram, we'll make some other decisions. Maybe increase our black point a little bit more just to move that over to the edge there. Pull our white point away a little bit so we don't have any blowing out highlights. We'll take care of those later in Adobe Camera Raw. And we'll increase the highlight smoothness because this will give us a nice, more smooth transition in our sky, which is what we want. And then maybe increase our lighting adjustments by about right here. I don't want to go too far because that looks really unrealistic. So let's just take that to about the middle point right there. Micro smoothing, I might even bring this up a little bit because I don't want the crazy detail in there. And I'm in the details enhancer here. There's a couple of options you have. I really do like the details enhancer. And I'm going to press apply. So now I'm going to save this as a 16-bit TIFF, save as 16-bit TIFF right into the source folder that we had for the example here. I'm going to save it right into here. Okay, close this down. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up that folder and just bring that image and the 0 exposure value into Photoshop. Okay, so now I've got the 0 exposure value from this one. Now this is for those people that don't like HDR. They just shoot the one raw file and play with that, okay? And now here is our HDR image. I make a lot of fun of these people sometimes, jokingly, really jokingly. I do like to teach people and educate people, and that's what I want to do with this tutorial here. So looking at this photograph, I can clearly see that I need to straighten my horizon line here. So I will do that. so that the horizon line is right on This is in Kansas City, actually, at the World War I Memorial. And another thing I'm going to do, just to make this composition a little bit better, is just drag this in right to here, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and sync these two images now so that they are both lined up the way they should be, okay? Let me sync them to, so that everything is selected. I need everything selected here. It's the crop that I need selected mainly. Okay, so now these are synced up so they both have the exact same composition. Now you can see the zero exposure value, it's got a good, I guess, kind of best of both worlds area here. It's not too much focused on the sky, not too much focused on the ground. But if we wanted to accentuate the sky, we would have to drop the exposure a little bit to bring that out. All right? But when we do that, we lose our foreground. So anyone instinctively is going to increase their shadows a little bit, or maybe go down to their black point and increase that a little bit, then maybe increase those shadows a little bit, and then look at the highlights and make the modifications accordingly. Maybe even increase that contrast a little bit, and probably increase that exposure just a little bit more, just to see more of the foreground. Now, we know with our tools here in Adobe Camera Raw, or if you're using Lightroom, that we can go to the adjustment brush. And in the adjustment brush, maybe we want this to come out a little bit more. So we just start painting this area in so that this becomes a little bit more of our focal points. It's more foreground focal point. Okay, maybe we want some more detail there, so we increase that. We then look at our highlights and our shadows here. Maybe make our shadows a little bit deeper, our highlights a little bit brighter here, just to really make this more impactful image. And then we might go over here to our gradient adjustment here, and maybe make our sky a little bit more yellow, and maybe add a little bit more contrast to it. Let's do that first. Add some more contrast to that sky. So the contrast in the sky is definitely brightening up a little bit more. We might even make our exposure a little bit darker up there, maybe make it a little bit more blue. Maybe add a little bit magenta to make that sky a little bit prettier. And then maybe come into our clarity, feather it out a little bit, and then go ahead and increase. And I'm just kind of playing here. But really what I'm showing you is what I've done to this image the whole way through is I've increased the dynamic range in this photograph. I've heightened the dynamic range. So if we go back to, let's say, the very beginning of all this, and we look at our preview image, this is the overall before. It's very flat, very washed out. Not a whole lot of depth. But in order to increase the dynamic range, we had to manipulate the highlights and the shadows. Notice I said we increased the dynamic range here. If you touch the highlights and the shadows adjustments, you have introduced a heightened dynamic range to your photograph. That's what those sliders are for. So people that say, oh, I don't like HDR, and they have this hoity-toity, snooty attitude about it, and they stick their nose up in the air like they're better than you because you do HDR, in fact, they are probably sitting at their house right now using HDR techniques on their image to make it look more like this. Now, that's the difference between something like tone mapping. Tone mapping, the difference between tone mapping and increasing the dynamic range in your file. Tone mapping will, in turn, increase the dynamic range in the file based on what it's doing by compiling the information from all of the raw files that you're giving it. But what it gives us is a much better baseline to start. If we were to come up here and even sync all of the settings to this image, we'll just sync everything, even these local adjustments. Let's go ahead and just sync everything up. Press OK. Look at how much better this HDR image looks than this regular image. There's more depth because there's more detail. Now, at this point, it's really overly contrasty because of where we started from. So if we just drop the contrast a little bit here, maybe even went into our adjustment brushes and looked at the adjustment brush for this one, and maybe looked at the contrast here with the highlights and shadows there, you can see that there's a clear and distinct difference between the two of these images. And quite frankly, the tone mapped image looks a lot better than the original image, the zero exposure value image. And the reason why is because there's more depth. There's more reality in those clouds. Those clouds look almost exactly like they were the day that I saw them. This concrete looks like the concrete that was there when I saw it. This, we'd be running over ourselves backward to try and get this exact look that we have in the tone map file, to really get this image to look like the scene that we saw, the scene that we were after. So I'm doing this not because I want to pick on people who say they don't like HDR. I want them to realize that they actually do like HDR. And in fact, they probably are doing the HDR process right now. They just don't even realize it. You can dislike tone mapping because of the look that it gives you all day long. That's fine with me. I have no qualms with that because I didn't create the software. All right. It's not my baby there. But don't disregard or lose sight of the fact that you might actually be doing HDR techniques right now on your images. Those of us who actually enjoy HDR, this isn't that big of a deal. And this is just a bitter diatribe for anyone who actually does enjoy HDR. But for those who do not like HDR, or quote unquote, say they do not like HDR, but then go into their highlights and shadows adjustments, they're actually hypocrites. So again, my name is Blake Rudis with Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com. I hope you learned a lot about this, about the difference between a single exposure, tone mapping, and the HDR process, and knowing the separation between HDR and tone mapping. It's critical to know the difference between those two for two reasons. If you are an HDR enthusiast, it's critical to know the difference between them so that you can have a nice argument with somebody who says they don't like HDR. And for those who say they don't like HDR, it's important to know the difference between heightening dynamic range and tone mapping, so that they can thoroughly understand what it is that they do and do not like. If you like this tutorial, please share it, comment on it, and subscribe. I can't stress that one enough. And I'm sure, especially with the nature of this tutorial, there's probably someone that you might need to direct to this tutorial because you probably have a friend or have ran into a photographer somewhere in your community that said, I don't like HDR, but then you see their images and they look very much like they used heightened dynamic range techniques. Again, don't confuse heightened dynamic range with tone mapping. Thank you very much for watching this. I sincerely appreciate it.